My name is Larry Post, and I am a lay minister at Sugarland Baptist Church. And my background is similar towards my accounting. My background is in accounting and finance, and I also am a CPA. Most of my training and my work background is in industry, although I was a controller for a regional CPA firm for 3 or 4 years. And like Ward and Troy, I felt the calling at one point in time about 10 or 12 years ago, and so I decided, well, I'm just going to go back and take some courses for just the fun of it. And so I went to my old alma mater, Houston Baptist University, and just took a couple of courses. And about that time, about 2 years later, the B.H. Carroll group formed, and so I'm about halfway through, a little over halfway through my Masters of Divinity program, and so I'm working on it. My track is a little bit different and a little bit slower than theirs, but I'll get there. I'm working on it. As Ward said, Ward and Troy are going to have been talking about the church side of it, but I want to talk a little bit about the personal finance side, and we're going to have 2 sessions of that. This morning's sessions, we're going to be talking more on the general overview and the receipt side of it and tithing and that sort of thing. And then this afternoon, we're going to be giving you some more tools on how to make get control of that nemesis of spending. And so that's kind of where we're going. So, well, we live in a nation known for its freedoms that it offers. We enjoy the freedoms such as freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom from the press, and that's just to name a few. But there is one freedom, however, that far too Americans experience today. What do you think that is? Many of us don't have the freedom from debt. Yes, financial freedom, yes. Some Americans are saddled with many thousands of dollars of credit card debt alone, not to mention car, student, and mortgage loans, just to name a few. As Proverbs 22:7 says, the rich rules over the poor, and the borrower becomes the lender's slave. Now, unfortunately for many of us, they have become slave to lenders, and debt for them has become a way of life. Dr. Tony Evans says there are now 3 groups of people in our nation today. They are the haves, the have-nots, and the have-not paid for what they have. Unfortunately, homes have been lost, businesses have gone bankrupt, and families have been destroyed as a result of debt. But the good news is you do not have to be a slave to that debt in any shape, form, or fashion. And one of the tools we're going to give you this afternoon is how to get out from under that debt. But debt is just one of the components of the overall financial picture. So let's back up a bit. Now, if you'll turn in your handouts there, in your notebooks, to page, I think it's on page 9, if I'm remembering right. Page 9 is the first, it's labeled Schedule 1 up at the very top. So we're not going to be looking at, and there's 4 schedules, and there's 3 more behind that. And we're not going to be looking really in depth at these this morning, but we will be referring to them in depth this afternoon. And as I said, we're going to be looking at them various times throughout the day. But before we dive into those schedules, we're going to look at some of the biblical principles and the methods for achieving financial victory for the individual and their family. And that's a key point that I want to bring up. You as pastors, you as individuals are not alone, or should not be alone in this financial trek that you're walking. You need to engage your spouse. You need to engage your children. And to a certain extent, and Ward and Troy are going to be talking about this later on, you need to engage your church. So it's a joint effort that you need to be looking at. These schedules, as I said, provide tools that you can achieve this financial victory for you and your family. These are, as I said, these are individuals' tools that will help you to not be so anxious about your finances. Worry is one of our biggest enemies, so much so that it can consume much of our time and much of our resources. How many of you are worried to any one degree about your financial picture, your personal financial picture? Obviously, to one degree or another, all of us are, have been, will be in our lives. I heard a story here recently about a man who worried so much, had so much on his mind, had so much concern about his, whether it be financials or family issues, whatever it was, he decided that he was going to hire somebody to worry for him. And so he found an individual and he said, I'm going to pay you $1,000 to worry for me. And the guy said, well, that's fine, I can do that. And so they talked a little bit more, and finally the guy that he hired asked the question, well, where's my $1,000? And the guy said, well, that's your first worry. So, but as we all know, in Philippians 4:6, it tells us that we are to be cautious and be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. So, don't forget, in all of this that we're going through, in all of the tools that we're going to give you, prayer is your first and biggest tool that you have. Now, as I said, there are 3 parts to God's plan for achieving and maintaining that financial victory in your life. The first 2 will be covered this morning. We're going to be talking about those. And then the third will be the biggest focus in our afternoon session. Part 1 of God's plan for your financial victory is giving to God. Now, on those schedules, that Schedule 1, if you'll notice up at the very top, it talks about it quantifies your receipts. And don't try to get too deep into the woods on that, because we're going to be talking about this in depth. But I want to draw your attention down to about mid-page there. There is a line for tithe. There is a line for tithe. Okay, kind of focus on that. And if I want to bring your attention to a passage in Deuteronomy 14:22 through 23, which says, you shall surely tithe all the produce from what you sow, which comes out of the field every year. You shall eat in the presence of the Lord your God, and at the place where he chooses to establish his name. The tithe of your grain, your new wine, your new oil, the firstborn of your herd and your flock, so that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always. Now, as believers, as Christians, we demonstrate a fear of God when you tithe regularly. In this passage, there are 2 words that we really need to focus on to kind of get a real baseline understanding of what we're talking about, to get a more integral, and it becomes a more integral part of this discussion. The first of these is the Hebrew word yareh, and this we can transfer to our word fear. Now that simply means to revere or to be had in reverence. In Proverbs 9:10, we see that to fear the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. In Ecclesiastes 12:13, Solomon said that the most important thing we can do is to fear the Lord. The second word in that passage that we want to look at a little bit is the Hebrew word ma'asir. That we translate to our word tithe, which means a 10th part, or a payment of a 10th. If you look at Schedule 1, which I talked about earlier, of your handouts, you will see that tithe is the first deduction from your gross household receipts. Now, don't get hung up on the terms right now, because we're going to be really talking about those. But there's that line item, gross household receipts, and from that you determine and deduct your tithe, and that becomes an integral part of your plan. Now, as a spiritual descendant of Abraham, you are to follow in the principle of tithing. In Genesis 14:18 through 20, we are told that Abram recognized that God was the possessor of heaven and earth, and accordingly he gave a 10th of his receipts. That goes exactly along with what Brother Ward was talking about, that God is the possessor of everything in the earth. And we are to give back a tenth of those blessings that he has made to us. Now, tithing started with Abram and continued into the priesthood of Jesus. The spiritual principle of tithing as a means of fearing God applies even to today. 1 Peter 2:17 says, honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, and honor the king. What happens if you withhold your tithe? What happens if you decide that you are not going to tithe 1 week or a month or something? Exactly. Withholding your tithe robs God of what is rightly his. You demonstrate that you fear God when you trust him with your finances. Again, let me stress, as you go through this plan, as you go through this planning process, as you go through your financial planning and everything, prayer and reverence towards God and trusting him to carry you through all of this is essential. It's primary, it's essential. When you take God's money and use it for reasons other than what he has determined, God will allow your resources to dwindle. In verses 9 through 11 of Malachi 3, God admonishes the children of Israel to bring the whole tithe into the storehouse so that there may be food in my house, and trust me on this. Trust me on this. That's the key passage there. Giving to God directly correlates with your ability to produce wealth. Don't get hung up on that word wealth. Substitute that word resources, income, monies that you can gather. That's your financial wealth. God encourages you to trust him in your tithing so that he will bless you. He can bless you. In Haggai 1:5-6, we see that failure to give God led to the Israelites' financial poverty. It says, now therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. You have sown much, but harvested little. You eat, but there's not enough to be satisfied. You drink, but there's not enough to become drunk. You put on clothing, but no one is warm enough. And he who earns wages to put into a purse with holes. Moreover, giving involves more than just money. It's about the recognition that God, as we've said, God is the owner and that we are merely custodians of his blessings. Accordingly, having a proper attitude about tithing is an integral part of God's plan for your achieving overall financial wealth and victory. So, part 2 of God's plan for your financial victory is saving. Saving. Now, when you save, you prepare for the future. Proverbs 13:22 tells us, a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, and the wealth of the sinner is stored up for the righteous. And in Genesis 41:34-36, we read the story of how Joseph instructed Pharaoh to save because of the impending famine. The Egyptians saved produce from the 7 good years so they would have a reserve for the prophesied 7 years of famine. Now, we're all familiar with the children's story of the ant and the grasshopper. Did you know or did you realize, however, that is one of God's illustrations? The wisdom of one of the smallest creatures on earth concerning saving is much bigger than many of ours. If you read Proverbs 6:6-8, it says, go to the ant, O sluggard, otherwise her ways and be wise, which having no chief, officer, or ruler, prepares her fruit even in the summer and gathers the provision in the harvest. The ant knows how to gather, the ant knows how to store away, and more importantly, she is preparing for later. And yet many people today who hold bachelor's and master's or even higher degrees have not yet learned this principle. And they wonder why there is so much stress when it comes to handling of their finances. If you look back at Schedule 1, page 9 there, you will notice that there are actually two types of saving. There is saving for emergencies and saving for long-term well-being. We're going to examine those in more detail in just a little bit later. But in his workbook titled Financial Truth, Guiding Principles from God's Word, Terry Austin tells us that although the purpose of this study is not to help people become wealthy, there is a basic truth about wealth that is very helpful to understand. And as we deal with financial attitudes, many people have set a goal of becoming rich. Others who are more realistic resign themselves to the inevitable reality that they will never become rich. In study after study, several qualities possessed by wealthy people emerged. It is common for people who have achieved financial independence to live what in reality are very frugal lifestyles. Early in their lives, they adopted a lifestyle that was well below their means, so they could begin the process of accumulating resources. Austin continues and provides three important benefits of saving a portion of those resources that God has blessed us with. The first of these benefits is preparation for emergencies. One of the primary reasons for saving is that it allows us to be prepared for emergencies. Now, what do you think constitutes an emergency? Loss of job, certainly. Health, right, or lack of, right. Car accident, exactly. Okay, basically, an emergency doesn't have to be a trip to the hospital or a total collapse of the car. A financial emergency is anything that was unplanned, that is, it's not in your budget. Because remember, we're going to be talking this afternoon about budgeting and allocating resources. So a financial emergency is anything that you didn't plan for. The only way to be sufficiently prepared is to set aside a portion of your income that on a regular basis, so that you can be prepared for these unplanned things, financial calls on your resources that come up. Now, you say, well, how much do we really need? Well, most financial planners, most people recommend at a minimum of 4 months of your household, your net household resources. Preferably, you want to have 6, and we'll be talking about that this afternoon. But that's really the bottom line, the bottom benefit. The second of these saving benefits is avoidance of debt. When you do not have money in any sort of an accessible savings account, an emergency fund, what is the only resource, the only fallback position that you typically have? Yes. We tend to go through and we pull out the wallet and get those credit cards because that's the only thing we have to fall back on. Well, if you have an emergency fund, again, that's anything that is not part of your budget, then you have the money to repair the car. You have money to buy the new washer or dryer or whatever. You have money for a doctor visit, those type of things. And so you have that money to be. Now, you have to be careful. And again, we'll talk about more in detail. But the question is, okay, I've used up most of my my emergency fund. What happens? You have to build it back up. So it's not just a one-time use it or lose it type of a thing. The third benefit is preparation for the future. It is a serious mistake to make financial decisions on the basis that you will always be able to earn an income. The majority of us will live longer than we can be financially productive. Even those who die during their productive years often have dependents, spouse, children, parents in some cases, that will be dependent upon us and will be in financial trouble if adequate preparation is not made. Look at 1 Timothy 5:8, which says, "But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than any unbeliever." Give you a little illustration of the power of savings. Benjamin Franklin was intrigued by the idea of saving money and the power of compounding interest. In his will, he left 2 trusts of 1,000 British pound sterlings to the cities of Philadelphia and Boston. Franklin directed that the income from these 2 trusts was to not be spent but reinvested for 200 years. When the money was finally distributed in 1989, Philadelphia's fund balance was $2.3 million and Boston's fund balance was $4.7 million. Obviously, the city of Boston had better financial planners than the city of Philadelphia had. Now, clearly you will not live for 200 years, and you may not have the equivalent of 1,000 pounds sterling to begin your investment, at least all at one time. Ben Franklin left us, however, with a great example of the power of saving and the value of compounding. The act of saving of at least a part of what we have been blessed with is an important financial tool that can help us avoid financial problems as well as providing a significant portion of reserves for both ministry as well as for missions. Saving helps during the time of unexpected economic hardship. Everyone should not only have to save for themselves, but it is just important to pass along that concept of saving to your children, to your descendants. Now, by this time you're likely saying to yourself, I really understand all of these principles. It makes perfect sense, but I just don't have the resources to do that. But I can just barely keep my head above water as it is. Well, I assure you, as Ward said, we're going to be addressing all of those issues. We're going to be giving you some tools and some methods to get out of this nemesis called debt this afternoon, both from a church perspective as well as on the personal finance side of it. So, hopefully that'll give you a little bit of an introduction as to where we're going, where we're headed with this thing.